What's happening? I'm Fieldy from Korn. Franco's done some work on me. He's dope, man. You guys check it out.
How you doing? This is Franco Vescovi. I've been tattooing for 16 years. I have a shop called Orange County Ink House in Lake Forest, California. Today we're going to be talking about portraits and my version of them and how I think they should be done. And we're going to go over a lot of bases. We're going to cover a lot of techniques, a lot of tricks to pulling these portraits off. There's a lot of talk about how to do portraits, and there's quite a few ways to do them. But the way I've chosen to do my portraits is from a lot of influence from Jack Rudy, Bob Tyrrell, and just different people along the way. Over the years, I've developed a lot of techniques and kind of fine-tuned them for myself, and I would just like to share them with you guys and see what you guys can do with them. And I can promise you, if you guys use all the techniques that we talk about, all your portraits and all of your tattoos will be advanced 100%. It's just a matter of applying them. It's just a matter of making sure that this hits home with you. And overall, I think that if we watch closely the video and listen to what we're talking about, you'll definitely see results in your next tattoo, almost guaranteed. I can't stress enough how important it is for you guys to understand that this video is not for every tattoo artist. This video isn't meant for anybody just to pick up a machine after they watch this and attempt a portrait. There's some things we have to cover before you're able to do these portrait tattoos, and there has to be a sense of honesty that you can have with yourself to make sure that you're comfortable with even attempting a portrait. This isn't for amateurs. This isn't for people that just started tattooing. I think 3 to 5 years is probably the minimum someone could even watch a tape like this to attempt a portrait. On that note, there's going to be a lot of techniques and tricks that we're going to cover today that's going to kind of get you feeling a lot more comfortable with your portrait tattoos, and it's going to definitely make a difference in your career. All you got to do is listen and apply these techniques. A portrait is an exact representation of a piece that someone brings in. It's different than any type of fantasy tattoo we do. Sacred hearts, butterflies, freehand skulls, all that stuff, you rely on your imagination, and that's good. That's a great other form of tattooing. But portraits, you can't use your imagination. You can't use any of your fantasy type of mentality on a portrait. You have to learn, and this is one of the main problems in portraits that I see, you have to learn to separate that. You have to learn to not rely on your imagination and to not rely on your interpretation of a face or a portrait. When you do a portrait, you're literally painting or drawing or tattooing only what you see. The piece I chose is Alfred Hitchcock because a number of reasons. If you look at this piece, I'm going to be able to show you how to do glass, wood, flesh tone, fabric, hair, wrinkles, contrasting shadows, personality, all the components you'll need to do any portrait tattoo, or any tattoo for that matter. Now I'm going to show you guys one of the most critical parts of the portrait tattoo, and that is the stencil. So I'm going to place my reference on top of the carbon paper. Now, all the techniques that are out there, this is one I find to be the easiest. It's more hands-on and it's more direct. I mean, you're literally tracing on top of the reference, leaving your stencil marking on the back. I like to use a number 7 lead pencil just to have a soft touch. Keep it in mind, you're going to want to capture every single element of detail you can. This is pretty much going to be your roadmap for the stencil. You want to make sure you capture every element of detail. I'm going to work on the face right now, you guys, and getting every element possible. Your portrait's going to be really only as good as your stencil. I mean, especially when you're doing something so exact. If it's going to be something exact, then you want to get it as exact as possible. One of the reasons why I like to do it this way, there's no worrying about registration or being off registration as far as the stencil is concerned. You could move this all around and it's still going to be exactly what you need it to be. There's a lot of different techniques to pick up shadowing. Mine's kind of like, I like to do lines and dots. So when I put the stencil on, it kind of reminds me that whatever's lined or dotted is a shadow. You want to pick up every amount of detail. I mean, not leaving anything out. You want to fine-tooth comb this thing, make it perfect. Little elements right there. Get into the nooks and crannies. All this information is important. Like I said, even though you have your reference right in front of you, you have to keep in mind you want to align your reference with your stencil. It makes it a lot easier than not having the information there, because you're doing a portrait tattoo. You're not doing a portrait painting or drawing. Something like that you can come up to the next day and correct, or you can erase, or you can paint over. But when you're dealing with skin, there's no cheating. There is no shortcut. You know, if you're doing a portrait drawing or a portrait painting, you know, you can come back to those things and fix them up and change them around. But you got one shot at a portrait tattoo. There's no eraser. There's no room for error. Very important to make sure you pick a good reference. Make sure you pick a piece that's detailed enough. You want to see a crisp piece. You want to make sure that it's just basically detailed enough to where you can see crisp eyes and mouth and things like that. You want to make sure that you pick the right portrait. A lot of times I'll have the customer bring back another piece if it doesn't work. Very important to dot where the highlights are going to be. I definitely choose the dot method on that. It just tells me, once again, when you flip it over and definitely put it on the skin, when you see those dots, it implies that they're highlights. Now this stencil is going to take me a while, and keep in mind it's a catch-22. The longer it takes to make the stencil, the quicker your tattoo will be. The quicker it takes to make your stencil, the longer the tattoo will take. Why? Because you're going to have to constantly reference back and forth because you didn't lay your roadmaps down properly. So very important to lay your roadmaps down very proper, getting every inch of detail. You know, for example, I didn't get that last part of the nose right there. But one of the ways you want to double check, you want to flip this around and lay this on a light table. You know, any light table will work. You just want to lay it on a light table. You want to look through the painting, or the reference, I should say. You want to make sure that you got every ounce of detail. For example, obviously I got this eye. I didn't get that eye yet. Now if I was to lay this on a light table, I would see that. But that goes for every little nook and cranny and wrinkle. You just want to basically nail every amount of detail. We'll flip it back over. Start on the other eye. Remember one thing as well, don't try to add your own input to this piece. Don't try to add your own style to your eyes or to your lips or how you do things. You want to do it exactly what you see. Nothing else. Obviously what I'm about to tell you guys probably already know, but when a client or a customer comes in and they bring an original, you want to make a copy of that. Before you start the stencil, just nail down the size options with your client and make sure that you're not doing it on the original. On that note, you want to make a copy at a place like Kinko's, or a place that has a photocopier machine, something that can give you enough detail that you need. Definitely not a standard machine. Not a standard copy machine will do. Something else to talk about is sometimes a client will bring in a picture that's not workable. And I'll tell you what, there's a lot of tattoo artists out there that will still attempt to do the tattoo. All I can say is I won't do that. The other day I had a client come in and she brought a portrait of her grandpa the size of a quarter. I looked at it and I knew it wouldn't blow up right. I knew it wouldn't be enough detail when I enlarged it in the copy machine, but just to kind of show her what I was talking about, I enlarged it, and yeah, sure enough, it came out really blurry. It was pretty much undoable. She was really adamant about the piece. You know, she was trying to talk me into it, and I basically said, look, there's no way to talk me into doing this piece. It's just not going to work. So just make sure that you guys are always firm with your customers when you know that it's not going to work. It's better to not do a wrong portrait than to do it and have it not come out the way you want. So never ever be afraid to make the customer go search for better references. Grab that highlight on the nose right there. I mean, I'm spending a lot of time on the face here, and keep in mind this face isn't that big. Let's go ahead and turn it around and see what we got. Actually, let's go ahead and jump over here to the glass. Sometimes I'll stop what I'm doing, I'll jump over to something else, and then what that does is it kind of pulls me into something new so that when I go back to the face, I'll immediately see things that I didn't get. So we're going to go to the glass right here, approaching it the same way as we did the face. Same thing with the reflections, I like to use the dots. This isn't your average face, it's not just a face, so we got all these elements. So this stencil is going to take a little bit longer, but keep in mind, I would say your average size stencil would probably be about the size of your hand, closed fist. And a face that size, you should spend at least 20 to 30 minutes on a stencil. I mean, literally master it like you're a photocopy machine. Hand stencils is the way to go for me. There's a lot of other ways to do them, but when you do a hand stencil versus tracing it and putting it through a stencil machine, you just have more control. You know, for example, I could move this any way I want, and it's still going to come out exactly perfect. You know what I mean? There's no registration issues to worry about like you would have if you were tracing this with tracing paper. So a good 20 to 30 minutes is what you want to spend on your average portrait stencil. This right here, however, will probably take me 45 minutes. This button is dark right there. There's nothing right there. It picks up again some dark shadows, disappears. There's two little dots that imply some shadowing. Then you got the 4 holes where the thread goes through. These 2 top ones are sort of bleeding together in the photograph. Sort of the same in the bottom. Now in reality, these 4 holes that the thread goes through, they're spaced apart evenly. But you got to tell yourself you're doing what you see, not what you know to be correct. I'll see people do stencils of portraits. They'll just leave a lot of information out. They'll just kind of rush the stencil, or they'll do their own version of the stencil. For example, in their mind, they'll see lines, and on the reference, it's exact lines. But what they'll do is they'll go towards their mind and just start doing lines, and we cannot do that. If you want to be a great portrait artist, you have to do only what you see. Portrait tattoos are stressful. They really can take it out of you. I mean, usually when I do a portrait, that's the only tattoo I do for the day. The reason why it takes a lot out of you is because you're doing it the right way. Obviously, if you get done quick or it didn't take that much to do it, you're not going to be winded. But I'll tell you what, when you do a portrait the right way, you're going to be winded. So we're going to be working on the stencil for another half an hour or so. We're going to go ahead and put all of our energy into the stencil, and then we're going to go ahead and start the tattoo. Now that we have the stencil done, the best way to cut the stencil out would be to cut it out from the back. So that way you can kind of make sure you don't overcut or undercut the stencil, because the less paper you have around it, easier it is to apply, especially when you're measuring an area. So I'm cutting around the stencil really close. Like I said before, the less extra paper you have, the easier it is to apply on the skin. Makes it easier to measure. And when you're doing a portrait, your whole goal is to make it easy as possible on you, because portraits are the hardest tattoo to do. And sometimes the stress can make you not do your best job. So you're basically trying to cut out the stress with as many tricks as you know about. So before I would even make the stencil, one thing to consider is just measurements. Measure the piece with a copy machine, blow it up a few different sizes that you think that might be the best size. And then you'll measure the skin. You know, when I say measure, we're talking about eyeballing, kind of putting copies on the skin and measuring it such like this. Okay, now what we're going to do is once the stencil's done, one little trick I learned a long time ago is just to give it some stress points by little cuts like that. So when you wrap it around the skin, it folds a little bit easier without distorting the stencil, because if the stencil's not put on right, it can affect the final outcome of the piece. Now, before I start the tattoo, definitely want to talk about why I have 2 different references. I have a dark reference that I turned up the contrast on the computer before I printed it, so that I could see every possible nook and cranny of the shading. That way I could make sure that the end result has as much detail as possible. Then I have the lighter version so that I could see what the darker version didn't give me, the details and the darks and the shadows. Something like this where there's a lot of black and a lot of dark, you want to have 2 different references just to kind of compare the 2 and to give yourself as much information as possible, so that when you're referencing, you can go off of both. So now that we got the light and the dark reference, I'm ready to go. Now I can give myself as much information as I need to pull this off correctly. Your outcome is only as good as your stencil is. When you're doing a portrait, it's one of those tattoos where you don't want to have to rely on freehand. Although it is possible, it's just more stress and more time for the tattoo. One more note about your photo reference. You want to make sure that your reference is detailed, and you want to make sure that you know that the reason why that is because it's only going to come out as good as your reference. What I mean by that is sometimes people come in with a small portrait. By the time you blow it up, it's fuzzy. And there's a lot of people that attempt portraits out there from bad reference, and then they are not happy with their final result. There's only one way to do a portrait, and it's called the right way. It has to be exactly like it, or you as an artist aren't going to feel like you did your best job. Now to apply the stencil, my favorite stuff is it's called Stencil Stuff. You can get it online, stencilstuff.net. The reason why I like this stuff, there's a lot of products out there, but what I found with this product is that, especially on a portrait, you don't want to lose your stencil. Everybody that's been tattooing can remember the times when they've lost their stencil. It's all right when you're doing a rose or a heart, something you could for sure freehand right away to fix. But when you're doing a stencil, you don't want to lose anything because then you're sacrificing the final outcome. So this stuff really, really makes it stick. It really makes it stay as long as you need it to. Okay, now that I've measured his leg previously, we're just going to put it on. I like working on legs just for that reason. It's just a good area to cover. Gently put it on, just kind of let it hit in the middle. Kind of hold it there, not really in a rush. You don't want to bend it. I usually put the middle on and I fold either the left or right side, doesn't matter. What this does is it ensures you're not going to distort your stencil. After I fold the right side, I'll pick it up a little bit just to give it some give. And then I'll start to fold the other side. Remembering that the better the stencil is, the better the final result will be. Now that right there is perfect. Okay, put my A&D ointment right there, just so I have it in front of me. Preparing the skin. I like to put a thin layer of A&D ointment over the tattoo area that I'm about to work on, just to kind of prep the skin, get it all ready for me. We're going to go ahead and start in the center. There's so many different types of blacks. There's always talk of what's better, Pelikan or Talons. I think they're both great. I just use Pelikan. I use it for the fact that it just seems to be a little bit easier and thinner to work, and your grays seem to come out a little bit more smooth. This is a Bug Pen 10 needle, and it's a 11 mag in a 9 mag tube. What that means is the needle's a little bit smaller. I'm sure people are familiar with the Bug Pens versus the regular number 12s, but I use the Bug Pen 10s. I got introduced from Bob Tyrell, that technique, and the needles are smaller, so it basically leaves smaller holes in the skin. And if you have a bunch of smaller holes, it's that whole concept of it looking more gradient and more faded and more shaded nicely versus the bigger holes. You can still pull off tattoos just fine with the number 12s, but for me, personally, the number 10s just do it a little bit easier. Okay, now we're going to start the tattoo. And once again, going to go into it with my shader needle. But keep in mind, I'm doing a lot of the simple shading, simple meaning the clothing, the items that aren't super detailed, such as the buttons or like the nose and eyes. So since we're going to be doing things that aren't really detailed, we're going to go in with the shader. When we get to the fingers, we're still going to use a shader, but what we're going to do is we're going to switch to the outline machine after we're done with this area to do tight cleanups. So here we are, we're going to go ahead and start. Also, one thing to consider is a lot of people don't take advantage of their needles as far as multi-use and angles. And what I mean by that is this is a 11 mag shader, Bug Pen 10, but to me it's also a single needle, it's also a 3 tight, it's also a 7 tight, depending on how I angle it. Right now I'm going into this as a single needle, so I'm going to just barely use the tip. I learned this from the master, Bob Tyrell. He definitely has this down pat. And don't be afraid to change your angle. It's kind of like getting a haircut as a kid. If you remember when you were a kid getting your haircut, the barber just kind of shifts you around, changes the angle of your head, you know, because for her it has to be right. So she's not concerned about you. She's concerned about how to move your head so it makes her job better to make sure you get a good haircut. Same with tattooing. You have to angle this machine to get your final result. Sometimes if you feel like not doing that, you can sacrifice the quality. A lot of times you'll see a portrait and when you zoom in, you look really close, it's a little loose. Okay, so now that we talked about the angles and how to get tightly into the grooves in the tight areas, I'm going to have you just watch me as I do this. I'm going to kind of complete this little section right here using those techniques we just talked about. A lot of you are probably wondering what kind of machine I'm using. It's not your standard tattoo machine, although it was one of the first machines invented as far as it being a rotary. I've been using rotaries for about 8 years now, and to me they have a lot of benefits. I mean, like I said, you could pull off a tattoo with any machine, as long as you have the knowledge. But for me, it's just more of a noise factor. The noise is very, very minimal. And when you're working for 4 or 5 hours on a piece, there's nothing more annoying than going home and still hearing that ring in your head. Also, it's very light. So as far as your wrist and carpal tunnel, that's kept to a minimum as well. I'm in the process of developing my own rotary machine. Later on, I'll give you the website to find it and see what you guys think of it. You always have to continuously stare at your reference. See, the thing is if I'm not looking every 20 seconds, then that means I'm relying on my own imagination to complete the portrait. And when you're doing a portrait, it's something unlike any other tattoo. You don't do your style. There's no such thing as a portrait done your style. A portrait can be done one way and one way only. It's got to look like the picture. That's why it's called a portrait. That's why it's called realism. A lot of times people kind of do their own thing, and the end result they don't seem to be happy about. Any other tattoo, you put your style and your soul into. But a portrait, you want it to be exactly like the picture. I'm kind of working on the side right here to get that line in there. I'm using the tips of the needle, like we talked about earlier, to shade the tighter areas. And for me, this kind of works like you're having a bug pin 5 or a 3 tight. It's the same type of concept. A lot of times people say, you know, how do you do a portrait with a shader machine without outlining it at first? And I tell them I do outline it at first. I just happen to know how to use this shader like an outliner. But when it comes to the face, I have a different approach on. It's definitely good to start out with the outliner. We'll talk about that when we get to the face. As I do a portrait, what I like to do first, I like to get all the black areas out of the way. I like to get as much black done. For one reason, it basically tells me, it sets the overall tone and the mood for the portrait. Now I can kind of relay every other tone to the black. So it makes it a little bit easier for me as far as the guessing game of what tones to use. It's a tight corner, so we're going to flip it to a single needle right now. You know, we're going to flip it and just barely work the tip. If you've never tried this technique, I learned it 2 years ago, so it's not something I've been doing for a long time, but it saves a little bit of time without sacrificing the detail. You never want to save time and sacrifice detail. But if you could save time without sacrificing detail, then why not? I'm tightly in this area again, once again working the single needle to a 3 tight. What I mean by that when I say working the single needle or 3 tight, talking about the angle of the needle. In fact, I'm going to kind of show you guys something right now. You use the tip of it. Now that right there is a single needle, and when I say single, I mean literally it's the single needle, it's the very end. You wipe it away, it's still in there. So with this machine or with this needle, we can get as fine as we need to. Just wanted to point that out. Remember, always looking at your stencil, always looking at your reference. Comparing the two, making sure. I'll talk about something kind of very, very useful to know is breathing techniques. You'll probably see me breathing a lot and wondering why I'm breathing funny. Anything in life, archery, shooting guns, all that stuff, they'll always teach you to breathe when you're pulling the trigger or whatnot. Tattooing, it's the same way. If you're doing something that's stressful and you really have to pull it off perfectly, kind of like shooting a perfect arrow, breathing really helps. Helps your mind be free, it relaxes you, and those two things make your tattooing ability stronger. That's not something you'll hear a lot of people talk about, but it's really important. A lot of times when you're in an area, I call it like a really tough area. Maybe the lines have to intersect exactly like the picture. You'll see me look back and forth a lot. It's just to make sure that I got it correctly before I pull the trigger and commit to a line. Keep in mind, this definitely isn't an amateur video. It's definitely not meant for people that are just starting to tattoo or just learning how. Definitely not meant for people that are apprenticing. It's meant for people that have been tattooing for years and have already understood the basic fundamentals of doing black and gray tattoos. Just because in this video I'm not going to teach you how to fade or shade. That's something you have to already know how to do to bring to the table to do a portrait. Also keep in mind, portrait tattoos are the most difficult tattoos you can do, and it's not something you want to do to somebody unless you know what you're doing. I mean, me as a portrait artist, I can't say that I've never done a portrait without it not being perfect, but there's times where when you're learning, it's not going to be as good as 5 years into the tattoo career. But keep in mind, you want to do as much practicing as you can on paper to even understand the fundamentals of a portrait, which is something I did. Before I ever did a portrait tattoo, I had been drawing portraits and I understood how they were done before I tried tattooing one. So if this is something you're going to attempt to do, just make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons. You're not trying to do portraits just to be cool. You're not trying to do portraits just to say you've mastered one of the hardest parts of tattooing. You're doing it because you love portraits and you really want to learn how to do them right. There's a lot of years that go into doing a portrait correctly, a lot of advice. Two of my favorite portrait artists are Jack Rudy, of course, and Bob Tyrrell. And both have sort of different styles, but they both nail the portrait. Another technique I use is zooming in and zooming in again. And what that means is when you're referencing, you're zooming in mentally, looking really deep and detailed at the portrait reference. But then you're looking beyond that. You're zooming in and you're zooming in again. You're going into the detail factor so deep that it helps you pull off a portrait exactly like the picture. I'm going to say that probably 100 times in this video, exactly like the picture. Because remember, that's what makes a portrait a portrait. It's got to be exactly like the picture. Only one way to do a portrait, the right way, exactly like the picture. Otherwise, what you have is an attempt at a portrait. And remember one thing, if you're doing a portrait on somebody, they're expecting you to do it and pull it off. They're expecting you, they've trusted you with their skin, they've trusted you with their parents, their kids, their deceased loved ones. Whatever portrait you're doing, they've trusted you with it. It's a very important spiritual experience to get someone's face on you. So when someone allows you the privilege to do a face on them, you don't want to sell them short. You don't want to convince them that you're a good portrait artist when you're not. And there's nothing wrong with not being a portrait artist. There's nothing wrong with not being a good portrait artist. as long as you learn before you attempt it and cover your bases. Once again, learning how to do it on paper first. Taking classes, getting videos. Good place to go for that would be airbrushaction.com. It's the website for Airbrush Action magazine. Great magazine. A lot of featured artists in the airbrush world that are really, really good. Look out for some videos by Corey St. Clair, and another good video out by Steve Driscoll. That guy can do portraits so detailed that he almost never leaves out the hair follicles or the sweat glands on a face. So that's something to know. Remember, you want to zoom in and zoom in again when it comes to portraits. You want to get really detailed. One thing I'd like to bring up, I said before, if you haven't started doing portraits on the skin, or even if you have and you're not happy with the end result, I would just urge you to pull back and to stop doing them until you've really took the time to get some videos and to get some instruction, because ultimately you don't want these people coming back 2-3 years from now wanting to get touched up or fixed up, and it's real hard to fix a portrait. It's almost impossible. Only way you can fix a portrait is if it faded so much that you can't even really see the first one. So just be real mindful of that. Don't be greedy, don't be selfish, and what I mean by those words is, if you're selfish and greedy and you know you can't do a portrait good or how you want it to be, you're going to just be out there attempting to do them, and that's not fair. It's not fair for your own reputation, let alone is it fair for the client who's probably paying you for the portrait. So there's nothing wrong with stopping. I did it myself. There's nothing wrong with stopping your portraits, going back to the drawing board and perfecting it on paper, understanding the elements of it, and then returning to the skin. And maybe you want to start off with what I always suggest to the people that I work with, or anyone that asks me about portraits. Once you get the fundamentals of a portrait down, don't even jump into a face portrait of a family member of somebody. Jump into a portrait, maybe a character from a horror flick, like Frankenstein or something like that, to where if it doesn't come out exactly like the picture, it's Frankenstein. There's a bunch of wrinkles and cracks on his face, so no one really will ever know, especially if you've already got the fundamentals of tattooing down. So you basically start doing those types of portraits first, and then when you feel comfortable, then you can jump into a face of a family member or somebody that's exact. Even an actor like Robert De Niro or Alfred Hitchcock, he's an exact person. There's no Frankenstein elements to him. So you want to save these types of portraits to after you've been experimenting with characters. And portrait tattoos aren't for everybody. I mean, it's one of those things where I don't necessarily do a lot of color. I don't do colored portraits. I don't think I'll ever even attempt to do a colored portrait. As far as I'm concerned, Nico and Mike DeVries, those guys are the masters at it. There's a few more people out there, but as far as I'm concerned, Nico and Mike DeVries, they're the first ones I've seen do the color portraits perfect. So I'm going to leave it up to them. There's no need for me to even jump into that right now. I'm going to stick to black and gray and leave the other stuff up to the masters. And believe me, those guys are the masters. In fact, if you Google Nikko, Nikko, or you Google Mike DeVries, Devries, those are some people to study as well. Look at their work online and check it out. It's some pretty crazy stuff. It almost makes me never want to do color tattoos again. The reason why I'm not talking about my techniques that I'm doing right now, as far as my shading, like I said, and I'll say it again, it's really important that you have the basics down. Really, really important that you have the basics of tattooing and pulling off gray. For example, if I was to do a scale from black to light gray, and that's all I was doing, I could pull that off, even if I didn't know how to do portraits. So should you. You should know how to get the perfect transitions. If you're doing a Sacred Heart, you're doing a skull, anything, know how to do the perfect transitions before you attempt to do a portrait, because all a portrait is nothing but perfect transitions. Off camera, I did a little bit more of the black, but before I finish this little area, I want to bring something up that's really, really important. A lot of times people do black, and what they do is they'll do this whole area the same tone. Maybe a little bit darker over here. They'll do this area the same tone, but when you're looking at your reference, you got to realize that it's not all black. It's all tones. One way to always check yourself constantly to make sure you pull it off right is you relate your tones always. So this is a blacker line. This is probably a 100% black line. It kind of goes up to like a 90, 80, 70% black in this area. And then the table he's leaning on, it's not black, but there's parts of it that are a 90% black. You just want to zoom in and zoom in again, like we talked about. Just zooming in, getting every single thing you see on, even the little nooks and crannies. Because, I mean, there's sort of a tiny reflection in this table. And I'm just going to capture what I see. Not what I think I see, but what I see. And it's going to, the end result's going to be that it looks just like the picture. In this table, there's darker shadows. And yeah, like I said, a lot of people just do one or two tones to pull what they think they see, and they're not really looking deep into the tattoo and the reference. So just always look super deep into it and just do what you see and break it down and break it down again. This whole portrait is 1,000 different portraits, and right now I'm doing a portrait of the table. So since I'm doing a portrait of the table, I'm going to pretend that that's the only thing I'm doing today. I'm going to lock myself out of everything else, and I'm just going to do a portrait of the table. So remember, it's a portrait of a table, not a table. If it was a table, I could do it my way and how I want. But it's a portrait, so we're going to do exactly like we see it. And we're going to spend time on it. We're not going to just get it done like a lot of people would. Constantly looking at the reference, constantly comparing it to the other light sources. Sometimes you get locked in on an area and you're so locked in on it that by the time you're done, it's too late. You did it too dark or too light, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. So you're constantly comparing the table to this black, the table to that black, the table to that tone. And it's real simple. You look at the picture and you say, is this darker or lighter than that? Okay, it's kind of like connect the dots. Once I've done this area, I've concentrated just on this area, this sets up how this is going to look. I look at the reference, I say this is about that tone. So I'm referencing from that tone. It's really important to set yourself up and cross-reference enough to make you have a headache when you're done. If you have a headache when you're done with the portrait, you're doing good. It's kind of like being on the computer for 4 hours. And every subtle detail of the black you want to capture. For example, it goes black, 90% black, and then sort of like a 30 to 40% gray, back into a 50 to 60% gray here. A lot of people will just do black from there to there, and a one tone of gray from there to there. Now what that makes it is a decent portrait, or almost a portrait. And remember, there's no such thing as an almost portrait. It's got to be exactly like the picture to be pulled off correctly. So you want to break it down. You know, I'm looking at the reference. I'm realizing that this area is darker right through there. So I'm just going to do what I see. It's really, really easy. Once you learn how to do the basic fundamentals, you do only what you see. This right here, this where the coat meets the glass, there's a darker bend of reflection. I'm going to capture that. As the coat dips into where his tie would be, it's darker. Right where the end of the coat meets his face, it's almost pitch black, but just a small little line. What you have at the end of it all is a nice portrait. Remember, this is a portrait of just that area. I mean, literally, when I say zoom in, there's a little part on here where it's a little bit sharper of a transition, and there's a little bit of another shadow right there, just so slightly. Never overdoing anything. You can always pull back and look at it. There's nothing wrong with pulling back. In fact, sometimes pulling back is what makes you not overdo a tattoo. a portrait tattoo anyways. Once again, just want to reiterate the fact that this might look easy, just like the other day seeing Tony Hawk skateboard on TV. It looked kind of easy the way he was skateboarding, doing these crazy tricks, but ultimately if I try to do that, I'm going to fall on my ass because it's a trick. It just looks easy. And to him it is easy. To me this, I wouldn't say easy. I could pull it off, and I know that I'll pull it off. And relatively it's easier than when I first tried to do a portrait, but ultimately it's not easy, and it might look easy just for the simple fact that it's going smoothly or trucking along, but there's a lot of techniques that you have to memorize to make it look easy and then for it to be easy. One of the techniques that you always have to remember, and I'll say it again, is you're constantly cross-referencing what you're doing. Like I said before, this is 1,000 portraits, all in one portrait, so we're constantly not locking ourselves into anything. As I'm locking myself into this part of the sleeve, I'm not really locked into it. It just looks like I am. I'm concentrating on it. But in the back of my mind, I'm referencing how this relates to this, how this meets the finger, how this meets the white under t-shirt. You're just constantly, your brain is constantly thinking when you're doing a portrait. You're constantly, and that's another reason why when you do a portrait, you know, everyone's got their own preferences that they like to, you know, do anything extracurricular while they're tattooing. That's on them. I'm not going to judge anybody, but one of my main beliefs is that you do a portrait sober. This stencil, like I said before, it's still hanging in there with us. It's still making it possible to shade up against the lines, which is really important when you're doing a technique like this where you're just using the shader to start out with. You really need these stencils to stay. And you know, some people, there's talk about a stencil as being a cheating technique. Well, when it comes to the actual portrait tattoo, you want your stencil to be perfect, because your whole time, I mean, you literally have to be a genius. If there's people out there that think they can pull a portrait off without using a stencil, I would sure love to get a copy of it and see it, because actually I'd have to see the video to really believe it, because when you're doing a portrait on skin, the skin bends. The skin, it's not like a canvas, it bends, it's different. You want to definitely just lock in your stencil and follow those lines. And believe me, there's no cheating when it comes to doing a portrait tattoo. That's why a very small percentage of people, tattoo artists, will ever be able to get it down. So there's no cheating at all when it comes to making a stencil. In fact, that's definitely one of the main parts of pulling this off correctly, is getting that stencil perfect and leaving it on. Let's zoom in again. As this jacket sleeve folds into the other side, there's a little bit of a darker shadow as it meets. It's such a subtle thing to even notice, but we want to get all the subtleties. That's what makes a portrait stand out, award-winning. That's what makes a portrait get you more portraits. Okay, as I'm coming in where the back of his jacket meets the front of his hand, or actually his arm, coming in once again with the whole angle of the needle, going for a single needle / 3 tight on this one. That's what it's equaling right now. Just working the angle, just working the tip. Okay, once again, we're going to talk about our setup. I like to use the Pelikan for the reasons I mentioned before, that they're just a lot more easy to work in the skin. Seems like the ink is broken down thinner and finer, and that's how it was put to me by Jack, Rudy, and Bob Tyrell, which they kind of influenced me to use it too, and I definitely see the benefits of it. So I have my all black ink as the first cup, and these two started out as just water, and I'm going to constantly keep changing them. But what I do is, this is of course my pure black, but when I want like a 90% gray, I'll dip it in the water with the machine running one time really quick. That's changed it to about a 90 to 80% black, and then 70, 60, 50, 40. The more you dip it and the more you bring it to the skin is when it makes it to be the gradients that we need. I'd say after about 20 minutes of tattooing, this actually becomes a 50%. And when it becomes a 50% and I'm working an area on the face or the hands and I need a 30 or 20% black and gray, instead of dipping into here and then going into here until I get to 30, it's way easier for me to dip into this 50% black and then knock it down over here with the water, 40, 30, 20% black. And then I'll start tattooing. I now switch to the outliner machine. What we were talking about earlier about doing the details, like the fingers and the glass and even the face later on, we're going to start to pick away at it with the outliner machine. A lot of people talk about using a single needle, and I started my first 3 years in the tattoo world with a single needle, and that works good too. It can take a little bit longer. Also, you got to realize that this, although it's an outliner, it's a 1205 RL, which basically is a tight outliner, but I'm using it like a shader. So that's why I'm going to be using this for the next probably 20-30 minutes or so on the glass, just picking away at the detail. And if you just want to watch the way that I go about it, is somewhat similar to how you would shade anything with even a mag, but keeping in mind it's just a small needle to just pick away at the detail. The reason why I choose a 1205 over a 3 tight or another smaller needle is that I find that sometimes when it's a smaller needle, it can kind of make the skin scar a little bit and heal bad the more times you go over it. When it's a bigger needle like a 1205, you seem to have a little bit more leeway with the skin and how it heals. But this needle right here just literally lets you focus and zoom in on the smallest detail. Now, just to reiterate, all these small details matter, especially when you have a portrait you're doing. You know, you want to show this piece to your friends and you want the people to be impressed, so you want to pick away ever so slightly using this technique with shading with the smaller needles is something that I kind of been doing for the last 3 years, and it's kind of stepped up my portrait game pretty heavily on the final product and how it looks. It's just it makes a difference. Small details do make a difference. And also too, I want to point out, if you're wondering why I'm not using the tip of the other machine, like I was talking about for quite a while, sort of talking about how you can get a single needle from that one, and as to why now am I using this one if that one uses a single needle. One important thing to think about is when you're going to be working an area like this, which is consumed part of a big part of the tattoo, you don't want to be having to use the sides of the machines for that long of a time. You want to get a different machine, different needle to tackle the job. Whereas before, when I was going into the corners with the sides of the shader, it's just a little bit here and then I'm back to my regular use of the shader, a little bit here. Whereas this piece right here is practically done entirely with the small needle. So we're going to stick to this for a little while. Also too, one of the main reasons why I like using the rotary is because it's so quiet. I mean, imagine shading the whole entire tattoo with the sound of this in the background. It kind of gets annoying after a while, especially when you've been spoiled with the rotary for so long. But I find the rotary to be a little bit too hard on the skin for outlining, so that's why I switched to this one. For the shade or for the outlining, I use the regular outlining machine. Kind of makes it fun to switch back to the shader after doing this one because this is a lot noisier. But when you're talking about this cognac glass that we're doing right here, we're talking about so much detail it has. It's got so much reflection on it. It's so minute that that's part of what's going to make this tattoo so nice, is picking away at all this stuff until it gets done correctly. The key to doing a good portrait, one of the main keys, is patience. All this stuff takes a while. You got to pick away at it. A lot of people are better than they are. They just don't know it because they haven't mastered patience yet. So if you could master patience, then you're naturally going to get better just from doing that. I think it's in everybody to just want to get it done, whatever your job is, whether you're an artist or working at a coffee house or anything. You just want to just do things and get it done quickly. But tattooing is one of those things where there's no other option. If you want it to be done the right way, you have to take all the steps to get there. And all those steps add up to more time, and you just have to do it. Otherwise you sacrifice quality. And we don't want that. Realistically, we could make this bottom part of the glass take only 5 minutes, but we're going to probably spend 7 to 8, maybe even 10, just nailing it away. And then when we put the white in, it's going to just come to life. I can't wait for the white. That's my favorite part. It just kind of brings the whole tattoo to life in a really cool way. Even on something like this, I'm doing a portrait once again. I'm doing a portrait of the bottom of a glass. So I want this bottom of the glass to look exactly like the reference. Constantly looking away. Even the shadows on his fingernail can't go unnoticed. All the portraits I've ever seen, or anytime anyone's ever stopped me to ask me about their portraits or anything like that, or ones that I've noticed in magazines, I look at the overall portrait, and then I look at how it was achieved and accomplished, and a lot of times you could tell the person was great at shading, but they just didn't give it all they had. One of my biggest opinions is everybody's better than they think they are. Just like everything, it takes a while to do it right. It takes a while to get it done. And this part actually is fun. It's just fun working the area, making sure that it's perfect. It's like a challenge. It's a challenge to me to make this better than my last portrait. I'll point something out just to kind of know how serious that I am about the detail part of this portrait. Even something as detailed as that being all black, and there being like a minute piece of the skin showing. As it comes up to the shadow, it then starts to turn gray. Just that little minute little spot right there. You take that approach to the whole entire portrait, you're going to have a very, very, very nice portrait, very nice final product. After you're done, you're going to really be amazed. Just stick to these theories and stick to these, I call them tricks, because that's all a portrait is. It's just a bunch of tricks and theories and techniques combined into one that you've learned and you've mastered. Most importantly, I'll say it again, is patience. If you have someone else coming in, you're late on one of your appointments. Perfect example. Today, I have another appointment later on, and I don't care. I'm gonna just pretend like I don't. If I have to reschedule, if I have to postpone, no matter what, a portrait is that important. You know, you can't really just stop it and come back to it. It's always better just to get it done in the same session. That way you don't lose your values, you don't lose anything. It's all fresh, you're in the mode. I wouldn't want to stop this and come back to it a week later. It wouldn't have the same energy, I think, you know. So no matter what, it's just really important to schedule enough time to finish a portrait. Give yourself at least an hour of buffering. All these things make a difference. Everything I'm mentioning, it sounds like a small deal, and in it by itself, it is a small deal. But, you know, you have $101 bills, you have $100 now. Everything adds up. Everything adds up in the final product. As long as you keep to all these theories and own them, you'll amaze yourself. A lot of people don't think of shading with a smaller needle like this, whether it be a single needle or whether it be a 1205, which is what I'm using. And to be honest, it's definitely very tricky to shade with this. I mean, like I said, if you haven't tried this technique out, maybe I wouldn't rush into doing it on a portrait for the first time. Maybe you can try, using it on a skull or something like that, a Sacred Heart, just your regular tattoos type of thing, different than a portrait. And keep in mind, part of the reason why it's hard to shade with an outliner needle is you don't want to overwork the skin, and it's so easy to overwork the skin, so easy. When I first started tattooing for the first 3 to 4 years, I did everything with a single needle. So I think that's kind of where I had that embedded into my head. If I did a big dragon or letters, I was kind of forced to do it with a single needle because I didn't really know what else was out there at the time. Now I sure wish I did. It would have saved me lots of time and energy. I like to repeat myself for one reason. I just know that, something as detailed as a portrait, you can't just tell somebody something one time. So if I sound like I'm repeating myself, anything I say twice or 3 times, just look at it like it's important to know. And what I'm about to say and repeat is the fact that everything else that I'm doing is I'm zoning out on. I'm right now doing a portrait of a cognac glass. That's all I see, that's all I'm focused on. To me, I'm going to pretend like that's all I have to do today, is a portrait of a cognac glass. I'm going to on purpose finish this whole entire glass with this needle, just so you guys can see the importance of picking away at the detail to really master it. A lot of cross-hatching on stuff like this is always helpful. This entire glass I'm doing with like a 50% to kind of build it up, 50% ink kind of gradient to fix it up to where it's going to be so simple just to add a darker tone than a lighter tone doing the whites. But right now just kind of doing it right in the middle, 50, and then slowly darkening it up. Just makes it a lot easier. Sometimes people like to rush into the thing, and any kind of tattoo they do, they rush into it and just kind of finish it going back and forth. To me, it gets confusing. It's better just to kind of lay out your overall with a certain tone, you know, mainly a lighter tone or a 50% tone, you know, and then start darkening areas up like this or like that, or these areas or these areas. But I like to lay this tone down overall for the first part of any type of portrait piece. Even little reflections, something really close. Whenever you're doing glass or a cup or anything like that, definitely want to pay attention to how the reflection in the glass plays along with the surrounding areas, like the finger. It just kind of helps you in the confusing state of mind that any portrait will put you in. You know, you just want to make it easier on yourself. So just constantly be aware of what's reflecting and how it plays a part in the glass or the texture. Now I'm going to go back with the 70% ink and kind of just lay it into my 50% ink just to kind of make it more of a 3D object now versus 2D. Like I was talking about earlier, just laying out your overall 50% tones, 40% tones, then you go into it and darken it up. Just makes it come back more to life. And it's easy to follow this technique, less confusion. So I'm thinking I'm done with the glass. Just gonna kind of like stop and pause for a second and just kind of check myself here. I like to say that word, check yourself, because that's part of what tattooing is all about. Especially a portrait, you got to constantly make sure that you're doing the best job you can, that you're following the orders. I look at it like this portrait is like a dictator. It's telling you what to do, telling you how to do it. and you have to listen to him and listen carefully and follow his instructions, you know. So when you do that, you see little things like I see here, like I got to darken this up a little bit to make it exact. Let's see what else pops out. Maybe a little bit darker over here. A little darker over here. There's some texture in the glass, kind of like miscellaneous reflections. Now it's really starting to come to life. When I put the white in here, it's really going to look nice. Okay. As far as my outliner machine goes and how I switched and the reason why I switched, I think I'm ready to go back to my shader now. Okay, I switched back to the shader machine. Now that I've kind of got all my road maps laid out for my tight detail, which is why we switched to the other machine and the other needle. So now I got my shader back. I'm just going to kind of do a little bit of follow-up, cleanup, you know, just making sure I got these overall tones. And this is stuff right now that you really wouldn't want to do with the outliner. And yeah, once again, just, you know, tightening up the fingers and getting that nice overall tone, the overall skin tone and shade. That's the fun thing about switching back and forth. It just kind of gives you a break into the next machine and just kind of gives you more of a chance to nail it down. Nailing it down is the key. Areas like this, where the finger is kind of got a lot of wrinkles and things on it, and there's just a lot of texture, it's good to revert back to the darker stencil that we made earlier. It gives you more of a roadmap to go off of for the darker shades and more the texture. Now something like this, when I'm back in my groove with the shader machine and I'm utilizing that technique where I got the single needle out, it's definitely a perfect example of the right time when to utilize that single needle 3 tight technique with your shader. You know, kind of, for example, we're going into just that finger and right there and a little bit right there, maybe a little more, maybe even a little more. Okay, one more important technique to think about is when you squint your eyes, sometimes you got to go back and forth and squint your eyes, and you'll see that this white color and how it looks on the reference, you got to keep it that way. A lot of times when people do white, they have a tendency to over scrub it and it turns gray, and it's not really gray. Sometimes you have to let the skin breathe. You have to I call it letting the artwork breathe. And in this case, there's just a little bit of shading on the bottom part of the sleeve. Then I'll get a really wash. This is really watered down. This is about a 10% ink right here. I'll just kind of transition that shade into the rest of the sleeve, and then I'll stop, you know, and it's done. You know, I don't want to overkill it. It's really, that's how it looks actually, a little bit right there. That's how it looks in the picture, and it makes for good contrast. Now we're moving on to this skull base thingamajigger. I don't know what it is, but it's a skull base, and we're just going to go ahead and do what we see. That's another great part of doing portraits. You don't have to know what it is. You just do what you see. We're going with about a 90% ink right now. We're just kind of building it up. Building up this bottom shadow. This shadow it's really important to see and notice how shadows meet other shadows. This base is a shadow, and how it meets the shadow of his jacket. You want to be mindful of how it does so and make sure that it's exactly how it is. Part of that is just, once again, relating your tones, comparing. Now we're getting some detail. This you know, like we said, I don't know what I'm doing right now as far as this actual marking that's on the base, but I'm just doing exactly what I see. And it's kind of a practice, or it's kind of a refresher to let you know that you're not in control creatively of this portrait, or any portrait. Your job is to do what you see, and that's it. There's a famous technique where you hold your painting upside down, and you do the portrait upside down. And what that does is it kind of tells your mind that you know, you're only going to paint what you see. So when you turn it upside down, it forces your brain to kind of make it not really a portrait at that point. It's just about painting shapes, because ultimately that's all this is a bunch of shapes and shades. And sometimes your mind can actually mess it up by trying to dictate to you how it should look, or what it could have to make it better. But we don't want that. Not when we're doing portraits. There's really not much to this base other than the fact that it's an object, and it's, you know, falls in line with a portrait. You know, there's not much really to talk about on this base other than just pay attention to the reference and just do what you see, as well as these reflections probably are the one thing that we can talk about. The reflections on this kind of represent the texture. You can almost tell that this is sort of either a shiny wood or a shiny, actually I'm going to go with wood. This to me seems like it's a shiny wood base from the reflection and how it looks. So kind of important to pick up on that type of thing. It makes it easier to approach. One thing to always remember, and everybody should already know this, but if not, it's always good just to say it. You know, when you're referencing to do a portrait and you're doing a portrait from reference, you want to make sure that if it did come from a colored source, if someone hands you a colored picture of your tattoo that you're going to do, you just want to double check and make sure you've changed it to black and gray for the reference. So once again, if you're doing a black and gray portrait and you have a colored reference, go to Kinko's, make sure you do a black and gray copy of it on photo mode. That way you're getting your exact tones that the colored portrait doesn't have. I definitely wouldn't advise a normal copy machine. It's always good to do the photo mode at Kinko's or a place like that that has access to those types of copy machines. This base right here, it's kind of fun to take advantage of the whole outlining that it has with the shader. We're going to kind of fade that out, so we're just going to kind of leave it light on purpose. I love these reflections. I don't know if you just noticed why and how I was moving my machine around. Sometimes you want to make sure you feel comfortable, you know what I mean? Before you approach it, you want to switch it around until you feel it, and then go for it. Remember, all this is a bunch of shapes, you know, just different shapes, different textures. On this particular portrait, one of the reasons why I chose to do this portrait is it's got so much to learn from. It's got so much. You got glass, you got wood, you got different shapes, you have texture, you have hands, you have buttons, wrinkles. I mean, this portrait has it all to learn from. You can pretty much apply all this knowledge that you'll learn today to any tattoo, you know. Your next Sacred Heart or your next skull or anything should automatically be better if you apply these techniques. Jumping back really quick to the outliner for two reasons. Remember one thing, you're always going to see things you forgot or passed up throughout the whole entire tattoo. I'm just kind of adding what I didn't get the first time, and it's up to you to not be lazy and pass these things up. They're like opportunities to make your tattoo better, I call them. So once you notice it, don't be lazy and say, oh well. Once you notice it, it's up to you. You got to get your liner and do some more. Right now, we're going to outline the skull. Skulls is something I love to freehand and add my own spin on, so I'm going to kind of take this opportunity to kind of add my own spin on the skull itself, but nothing else. Just to make it a little bit more fun. This is getting back into, I mean, we could touch on a couple of little techniques that don't have to do with portraits, just because we're going to go ahead and we're doing a skull. It's part of a portrait piece, and since I'm kind of adding my own flair onto it, it's going to be just a fun, kind of like a fun break. It's almost like a little break getting away from being so stressed as far as having to pull this off correctly, because let's face it, portrait tattoos are stressful. Anyone who's ever tried it or done it before, it's just a very stressful tattoo to pull it off. And we're talking somebody's skin. You know, you're not just trying something on paper, you're trying it on somebody who's going to comment on it. I like to do a lot of texture on my skulls. It's just makes it a lot more funner to look at when there's a lot going on, you know. I want to make the skull super detailed. Once again, you know, like I said earlier, you're going to always find things that you could do a little bit better. Sometimes when you focus on something, it's impossible for you to see it all. It's almost like you got to come back to it. So over here, I'm just kind of making the shadow not so tight. Switch back to my trusty shader. There we go. This right here, we're just kind of building up that medium tone like we were talking about earlier. Get a medium tone on there, and then you get to go in there with the darks and bring it out. Sometimes it's the easiest little techniques that make the difference. The reflections, the water droplets, things like that is what makes tattoos a lot more impressive. A lot of these techniques, though, once again, you can apply to anything. Glass, wood. The fun part about tattooing when you get into textures. All right, now for the fun part. Skull. Skulls are always fun. I don't know why, but they are. Something fun about this particular piece is the fact that usually the portraits I do is a face or it's of an object or a person. Whereas this one, it's got, you know, a face, but it's got two objects. It's got the glass and it's got the skull. It's kind of not really in your everyday portrait. So I'm kind of taking advantage of it and making it a little bit more of a custom piece. and I can get really heavy into the texture, which is kind of one of the reasons why I chose to add a little bit of my style into it, just because the picture didn't really have enough texture, and I'm gonna really go off on the texture and make it interesting with cracks and pits and stuff like that. One thing about the texture is you kind of do the overall tone with the shader, then you kind of go back with your outliner and add a bunch more detail. It always helps when you have somebody that doesn't complain about the pain. This man is doing pretty good, no complaints. I haven't heard anybody say ouch yet. Yeah, this is definitely a little break. This is kind of like a mental break right now. I'm just kind of getting to pull away from the whole detailed portrait and kind of having fun being loose with the skull. What's going to really make this skull pop is when I add the white. It's going to really pop out. A fun technique I might share with somebody that might not know is sometimes you go over the whole tattoo. Part of making the tattoo look super realistic is however you part of the skin is touched with some kind of gray. So sometimes grazing over the whole thing makes it in the end look super soft and really portrait style. Now I'll switch to the outliner. This is like a 100% black right here. Just kind of going in there, getting the detail in. Cracks and whatnot. Little pits like this is just stuff that's funner to do with the outliner machine. Just lots of texture. Okay, we are back to the shading. We're gonna knock out to the rest of his coat, and then we're gonna work our way up to his hands, and then his face. Last part for the black and gray before we do the white. This is the best part of having a good stencil. This stencil is really telling me a lot of information. Another aspect to think about when you're doing a portrait is, you don't really want to do it just for the money. You don't really want to get into portraits just for the money, because I don't think you'll ever grasp the right way to do a portrait if that's your motivation. Although, if you ever do get to the point, which is very possible, to master portraits, you should definitely be charging a good amount of money for the portraits. They're really hard to do. It's more of a specialty field, and a lot of the guys that do portraits and do it well charge up to $1,000 or more to do them right. So you're giving these people something that's virtually priceless. If you can pull off a portrait like you're supposed to, you're giving them something that's more than a tattoo. It's more of a gift at that point. Just working that shadow again, making sure that it falls exactly how it should. Shadows are definitely interesting because they're actually not that easy. Shadows within shadows anyways. Those are the hard ones when you do a shadow within a shadow. Just working that shadow again, making sure that it falls exactly how it should. Shadows are definitely interesting because they're actually not that easy to do it right. Just knocking out the coat a little bit. It's just it's always fun doing drapery and stuff like that. This kind of falls in the drapery category. Really important when you're doing a portrait of drapery and not just kind of freestyling it, to make sure the same rules apply to the to this jacket as if you were doing a face. You'll basically look at the reference and see that even though he probably has a black coat on, just the way the picture's taken, it's going to be 3D looking, so therefore it'll sort of look gray. Once again, utilizing the tips of the needle and making sure that you're getting all the use you can out of every curve and bend of the needle wherever you need it to be. I'm having fun with this portrait. It's just got a lot of fun elements to it. Another helpful technique when you're doing the overall shading, meaning, you know, you got this huge area of gradient and you definitely got to pull it off to where you can't see any, you don't want to see any lines or any like needle markings or whatnot. You know, you want the goal of every portrait artist is to make it as smooth as possible. One of the ways I do that is what I like to do is kind of graze over the whole thing with a really light gray. It kind of opens up the skin a little bit. Makes it easier to start laying in your darker and darker and even darker tones. Just kind of open up the skin. Just kind of switching it up every time you go over it, you know. You go over it that way. Now you're going over it this way.